After working overtime to the point of sudden death, I woke up to find myself locked in a biting match with a muscular kobold. It was biting my shoulder. I was biting its neck. Whoever let go would die. My mouth was full of the taste of blood, and in my ears was the sound of bones cracking. I didn't let go. It died. My teammates looked at me like I was a monster. My name is Leo Mundo. On the first day after transmigrating, I survived by biting someone, starting from the first stirrings of life underwater. A familiar game narrator's voice woke me from the nightmare. A splitting headache, a burning sensation all over my body. My brain felt like it had been run through a blender. I only worked overtime for several days straight and went home to start a game of Civilization 6. Was that really enough to put me in a coma? I forced myself to open my eyes through the intense pain, my mouth full of a rusty blood taste. The cold wind howled. On a muddy road, a refugee convoy struggled forward. Donkey brays, children's wails, and drivers' shouts filled my ears. I was lying in a donkey cart, covered with a tattered wool blanket, with bundles and animal hides piled beneath me. A blonde, blue-eyed girl was kneeling there, cradling my head in her arms, watching me the whole time. When she saw me open my eyes, her worried little face immediately broke into a smile, and she shouted down from the cart, "Leo's awake." A rough voice came from below, and a large calloused hand grabbed the railing. A burly, bearded man wearing a horned helmet stuck his head up and grabbed my head, twisting it left and right. He clicked his tongue and said, "I wouldn't be this pale even if I'd been dead for 3 days." The donkey cart groaned under the weight and tilted to one side. "Dad, get down already." The girl pushed the strong man away and carefully wiped the blood flowing from my mouth and nose. It hurt. My head felt like there was a blender inside it, churning up a fragment of incomplete memory. More than 100 kobolds swarmed down from the hillside toward the convoy. These things looked like large golden retrievers standing upright, with thick limbs and canine claws and fangs. The kobold leader at the front was 1.5 meters tall. The other kobolds were generally around 1.3 meters tall, packed together in a chaotic mass, while a few stragglers dropped to all fours and sprinted wildly. The convoy reacted quickly. The donkey carts were gathered together, and the old, the weak, the women, and the children hid in the rear. The militia formed ranks and advanced, while those with bows climbed onto the wagons to fire. As the newly appointed captain of the militia, the original owner of this body, Leo Mundo, had appeared especially calm. Kobolds were not very strong in combat, and their fighting spirit was weak. In several previous ambushes, they had fled in panic after only a brief clash. Unexpectedly, something went wrong this time. When the kobolds had charged halfway, the leader let out a savage bark, and all the kobolds hurled their short spears in unison. More than 100 short spears came raining down, catching the militia off guard and instantly throwing them into chaos. The militiamen with wooden shields had their shields shattered and were killed, pierced through like sieves. The militia company had fewer than 50 men, and a third became casualties. That was only because the kobolds' aim was poor and those in the back lacked the strength. Some of the short spears fell in front of the formation. Seeing their comrades die and hearing the screams of those pierced through, the shield wall immediately began to collapse. Leo, shocked and furious, picked up a short spear and hurled it back, accurately piercing a kobold as he shouted for them to hold formation. But it was already too late. The kobolds had reached them, and the melee began. Kobolds were small in stature and widely recognized as weak fighters, but years of mining and hunting meant their muscular strength was no less than that of human commoners who lived on thin porridge. Combined with their sharp fangs and claws, an individual kobold was more dangerous than a wild wolf. As for the militia, they were just ordinary commoners with only basic training. Most of their weapons were personally brought scythes, pitchforks, and axes, and fewer than half had leather armor. The two sides were evenly matched in individual strength, and in the melee the seasoned, composed militiamen maintained the shield wall. They barely managed to hold off enemies more than twice their number. A few hot-blooded, panicked recruits broke away from the formation and were immediately pounced on and torn apart by the kobolds. Once you went down, there was no getting back up. Wails and blood rapidly crushed morale. The most hot-blooded and reckless of all was the newly appointed captain of the militia. He raised his shield to block a throwing spear, then split open the skull of a charging kobold with one slash of his sword. He crouched to drag back an injured militiaman, glanced around, and at the sight of his comrade's gruesome state, his eyes turned red with fury. While shouting for everyone to hold formation, he himself leaped out, carrying a hide-covered wooden shield as he slammed aside a smaller kobold. He charged at the biggest and fiercest kobold. This kobold leader was a head shorter than Leo, yet the muscles beneath its mottled fur were even stronger. Basically, a devilishly muscular pit bull pumped full of protein powder. In the previous attacks, it had always stood far in the rear, almost never entering bow range. Leo's instincts told him that if he cut down this leader, the weak-willed kobolds would rout. Seeing Leo charge, the kobold leader let out a frenzied bark and swung its flail down at him. One blow shattered the shield as the 2-kilogram pig iron hammerhead came whistling down and smashed the hide-covered wooden shield to pieces. Leo seized the chance to drive his blade into its abdomen. Enduring the piercing agony of fractures in his left hand, he twisted the hilt with his right and churned it around inside the creature's belly. Though this was clearly a kobold, it had the build of a gnoll-like orc. Acting completely unlike normal, it ignored the pain, smashed Leo in the chest with the flail, then lunged bodily and knocked him to the ground. It bit for his throat. Leo twisted with all his strength to avoid the vital spot, and it sank its teeth into his shoulder instead. Fortunately, he was wearing a bearskin shoulder guard with iron strips embedded inside. Although the fangs sank deep into the flesh, it ultimately failed to crush his shoulder blade and tear the whole shoulder off. Driven mad, Leo had lost feeling in his left hand, while his right still clutched the knife and crazily churned the creature's guts. But he was powerless to break free from its hold. The original owner of this body, a violent brute and clearly no gentleman, immediately bit back, sinking his teeth into the kobold leader's sinewy neck. And so they remained locked in stalemate, until he passed out from blood loss. The memory was so vivid it made his scalp crawl, and the trauma to the body mercilessly became waves of pain assaulting him from every direction. I'm just an overtime working homebody. When have I ever been through such primitive, savage combat? So this means, right at the start, I bit a kobold to death. It hurt so much. I'd rather have just dropped dead suddenly. I want to go back. He shook his head, and amid the violent dizziness, what little remained of his brain squeezed out a bit more background. This world was a typical Western fantasy world, with many gods and numerous races living side by side. The Olandis Empire, where I am, lies in the eastern part of the Dawnlight continent and borders the Orc realms of the northern snowfields. Several hundred years ago, the empire rose to power and unified the southern kingdoms. Together with the northern tribes, it drove the orcs and trolls deep into the northern snowfields. Like the transition from the classical age to the Middle Ages, the glorious and vast empire gradually declined and fell into warlord fragmentation. The northern province is now ruled by the Odolov family, and the economic and military center of gravity has gradually shifted south. Small orc warbands and troll scouts have begun appearing again near the North Ice River, raiding villages along the southern bank. The village where the original owner lived was the first to bear the brunt. If not for Uncle Julian, who had retired and returned home, expanding and strengthening the militia and holding off several waves of raids, the village would already have become ruins. But this couldn't go on. After holding out for a year, Uncle Julian made a bold decision. He would lead the entire village in a migration to the southwest, crossing 1,000 li from the northernmost edge of the Count's domain to the southernmost. They would carve out a new home in the river bend at the foot of the Great Barrier. It was a place where he had once been stationed for many years. There were only a few small non-human tribes there, and no high-level magical beasts appeared. Through his connections with his comrades, he obtained a pioneering charter authorized by the Freylov family. As long as he could gain a firm foothold and reclaim enough wasteland, he could be granted the title of Pioneer Knight. As for a more detailed background, don't ask. Mundo's head can't hold that much knowledge. The original owner, Leo Mundo, was a typical single-minded brute, a born battle maniac. His mother died in childbirth. His father drank himself to death, leaving him with no one to teach or raise him. Today he'd steal cornbread, tomorrow beg for thin barley porridge. In winter he'd snatch a widow's bathwater. In summer he'd swindle kids out of sour plum soup. He'd kick a dog twice even if he just met it on the road, and once dragged back a half-grown snow bear cub from the mountains with his bare hands so the whole village could eat meat, forcing the whole village to keep watch at night against the mother bear's revenge. Before the mother bear could take revenge, he took advantage of its hibernation and buried it alive. When they dug it up 3 days later, it still wasn't quite dead. At 15, he was unbeatable in the village. Then Uncle Yuliang, retired and back home, promptly lifted him up with one hand and beat him, after which he was drafted into the militia to train his martial skills and charge into battle, more barbaric than a barbarian. He is currently 17, and has somewhat come to his senses, though though not by much. Olivia? I pondered slightly before speaking, my voice hoarse like sandpaper scraping, with a strong smell of blood hitting my face. I don't know whether it was the Kobold Chief's or my own. My left hand was bound with wooden splints and propped to one side. I didn't know if it was crippled or not. My chest had been smashed by a flail, and quite a few ribs were definitely broken. If I kept coughing up blood, then my internal organs had to be injured too. My shoulder, on the other hand, was only lightly wounded, protected by an iron-strapped bearskin shoulder guard. Although it had been bitten through with 2 rows of bloody holes front and back, it had already scabbed over. As long as I don't get rabies, it'll be fine. I'm here, Olivia answered softly, her slender fingers brushing aside the blonde hair on my forehead damp with cold sweat. Where are the kobolds? You drove them away. Her body trembled slightly. As the person involved, I only remembered biting the kobold chief to death, but as an onlooker, Olivia had hidden behind the cart and watched with her own eyes that tall, stout, heavily muscled kobold chief struggle wildly on the ground, biting and clawing, shredding Leo's leather armor to tatters and sending blood flying everywhere. Yet its neck remained pinned to the ground as if locked in a beast trap, and it couldn't break free even until it suffocated to death. Who would have thought such a handsome, sunny blonde boy would be such a blockhead? The other kobolds saw their chief's miserable end, and in less than a minute they broke and fled madly, leaving corpses all over the ground. That's good then. I nodded, but I was still deeply worried. Kobolds are bullies by nature, preying on the weak and fearing the strong. They only attack in groups when they outnumber their prey by at least double, or even several times over. The fact that this group of kobolds dared ambush a caravan with nearly 50 armed militiamen and a total of 300 people was itself unexpected. But the main reason lay with the caravan itself. When they set out, the whole village, together with survivors gathered from nearby villages, formed a large caravan of nearly 1,000 people, with more than 100 militiamen on routine patrol and quite a few retired veterans like Uncle Yuliang. And outside the militia, not everyone was utterly helpless either. In a real life or death crisis, they could still muster 200 or 300 able-bodied men. But the migration route stretched for 1,000 miles and took more than a month, passing several prosperous and peaceful small towns. Those with a bit of property, a trade, or some ability gradually left the caravan. In the end, these 300 people remained, the ones in the village who trusted Uncle Yuliang the most, and at the same time mostly the old, the weak, women, and children. There were only about 100 who could be counted as able-bodied adults. This is the flaw of a non-noble pioneer. Not only is there no family support in supplies or military strength, there is also no official authority to bind the people to you. The people in your hands are not serfs. They can leave whenever they want. It's not like a noble lord who can hold them accountable. According to what Uncle Yulian described in my memory, there were several other alien tribes around Riverbend with strength comparable to this kobold tribe. Could this severely diminished pioneer party really keep going? Leo, don't worry. Focus on recovering. Dad is here. Olivia seemed to see through my worries and gently stroked my forehead in comfort. In her eyes, her father Yulian was all-powerful and capable of anything. There was nothing he couldn't do. In the original Leo's eyes, it was the same. I nodded and smiled back, then fell silent again. So from now on, there would be no more Leo, only Leo Mundo. Transmigrator Dogbiter, Militia Captain, Leo Mundo. The caravan struggled forward amid Uncle Yulian's shouts, and all along the way he kept yelling to lift everyone's spirits. The group headed south for 1,000 li along the World Tree Avenue. After reaching the watchtower where he had once been stationed, they proceeded west along the Anzino River. Crossing more than 30 li of primeval forest would bring them to their destination, Riverbend. A mere 30-odd li, yet it was harder to traverse than the previous 1,000+. Not to mention the beasts lurking in the shadows. The kobolds alone launched as many as 4 ambushes, and the casualties in the last one exceeded the total of the first 3 combined. Of the 50 militiamen left, only half still had fighting capability. I, the militia captain, was also too badly wounded to get up. One mishap after another reduced our pace to the lowest point, nearly bringing it to a standstill. Everyone in the caravan was rolling in the icy mud, struggling against hardship. How much farther is it? When will we get there? Some in the group cried, others shouted. We'll be there tomorrow. We'll be there tomorrow. Everyone keep pushing. Yulian jumped onto a huge rock, waving his horned helmet and shouting at the top of his lungs. There are fat fish you can catch with a stretch of your hand, elk running all over the place. Great trees you can chop down as you please, vast stretches of fertile land, and everyone will be able to eat their fill." He had shouted the same words all along the way. The children had even turned them into a nursery rhyme. Yet there was no denying that they truly lifted people's spirits, helping the villagers hold on by a thread. If Uncle Julian hadn't possessed enough skill and prestige, and if the villagers who had followed him from so far away hadn't already had no way back, this frail caravan would have fallen apart long ago. But no matter what, after countless promises of "we'll be there tomorrow," the villagers' caravan finally reached its destination, Riverbend. It was a huge riverbend peninsula where countless years of silt deposition had formed a vast plain. Unlike the dense primeval forests on both banks of the Great River, the Riverbend Peninsula was covered entirely in grassland and small lakes, with only sparse little trees and shrubs growing on scattered hills. On the winter prairie, the withered grass stood thigh-high, and even the snow had failed to completely crush its thick roots and stalks, showcasing the richness of the land. Even a layman like me could tell this place was extremely suitable for land reclamation. After waking up and lying there for another 3 days and nights, I was finally able to stand up and walk upright. During this time, the original host's memories were like fragments of a mirror that had fallen from a great height, shattered and scattered, chaotic and disordered as they pierced into my mind, constantly and subtly reshaping my cognition and personality. I was in a daze the whole time, but the original host had lived in a daze to begin with. Lying in the wagon and unable to move, I showed not the slightest abnormality to the people around me. The caravan stopped on a gravel beach, and everyone let out a sigh of relief, with the joy of having survived a disaster. But even more than that, they were bewildered about where to go from here. Uncle Julian jumped onto a wagon and loudly assigned tasks, directing the villagers to fell trees, chop firewood, set up cooking pots, and make meals, and pitch camp. The camp, which had just fallen silent, came alive again amid the shouting. I left the chaotic camp and sat on a huge boulder on the riverbank, enjoying the respite earned by my injury. Before me flowed the Anzino River. It originates deep within the Great Barrier, plunges from an altitude of several thousand meters, then flows more than 2,000 li to the northeast before joining Storm Fjord and emptying into the Ice Sea. Though only a tributary, it is still a major river important enough to be named on the continental map. Its river course is gentle, its frozen period is short, and its fishery resources are abundant. Compared with the perennially frozen North Ice River, this is the true mother river of the people of the North. This river bend belongs to the upper reaches near the source, and the water surface is not especially broad. The swift river slows as it passes here, and the channel, more than 50 meters wide, suddenly expands to over 100 meters, like a small lake. In the crystal clear water, schools of fish can be seen roaming in search of food. Looking west into the distance, beyond the snow-covered mountain range, sheer cliffs tens of thousands of feet high rise straight from the ground, their tops disappearing into the clouds, as if at the end of the world. That is the Great Barrier, forming a gigantic circle in the center of the morning light continent, like a giant tree stump on flat ground. What I can see is only the tip of the iceberg. The waters of the Anzino River fall from the clouds at the horizon, pouring down along the steep cliffs, with more than a dozen enormous waterfalls crisscrossing one another in a magnificent sight. To the north, across the river, lies an endless primeval forest, where thick snow rests on the crowns of gigantic coniferous trees so wide that several people would be needed to encircle them. A herd of antlered deer as large as horses is drinking on the far bank, and the fawns stare at me curiously, letting out soft calls. Uncle Yuliang said that place was originally a vast grassland called the Wolf-Driving Plain, where the beast folk once raised dire wolves, the birthplace of the wolf cavalry. Back then, the beast folk wolf cavalry legion was a force that could rival the Empire's armored knight order. But after the beast folk retreated far beyond the North Ice River, the grassland was covered by forest through the combined efforts of beast folk shamans and elven druids. Countless glorious beast folk ruins have been swallowed by the vast wild forest. What the original owner admired most about Uncle Yuliang, aside from the martial skills he had learned in the army, was his gift for spinning stories. In his mouth, everything had a long history and a story captivating enough to draw people in. Before long, Olivia came over to check my injuries for me, and only after confirming there was no problem did she sternly remind me, "The tent has already been set up for you. If you're tired, go lie down by yourself. Don't wander around or move too much, understand?" "Got it." I nodded obediently. After watching the scenery for a while and shivering in the cold wind, I finally returned to the camp and found the tent. It was a small tent stitched together from all kinds of mottled furs, stuffed inside with hides that were all trophies from years of hunting. Because the skinning and tanning techniques were so poor, and from excessive use, many of the furs had already turned into clumps of fluff. Even so, it was still one of the few good tents in the camp, at least warm enough. Outside the tent, a child covered in mud was crouching there, shivering. He hugged his knees with both hands, wrapped in a little blanket full of holes, pressing his back against the tent in an attempt to keep out the cold. I walked over and kicked him into the tent, saying mockingly, "Little mouse, did you find anything to eat today?" It wasn't that I wanted to kick him. It was the original owner who wanted to. More than 10 years of living as half-savage, half-bandit had etched rudeness and violence into the blood, constantly influencing my behavior. The moment the kick went out, I instinctively held back. But I still sent the child rolling all the way into the innermost part of the tent. Lying face down in the pile of furs, the child dully shook his head, his vacant face showing not the slightest emotion. This child I called Little Mouse was less than 1.2 meters tall, thinly clothed in skin and bones, with black hair and black eyes that were very rare in the north. I first noticed him more than 10 days ago, one morning, under the donkey cart. It was snowing lightly that day. He had hidden in the mud beneath the cart, curling up to sleep on a little blanket spread out there. That blanket was less than half a square meter, and once laid on the ground it couldn't cover his body. By the time the original host found him, he was already frozen stiff all over. Perhaps it reminded him of his own childhood. So he casually picked the child up and tossed him into the pile of rotten furs in the tent, then fed him his own breakfast. Unexpectedly, this child who was almost no longer breathing really did come back to life, and from then on followed behind the caravan. He was nowhere to be seen during the day, and at night he curled up in a corner of the tent, managing to live another half-month. But while the original host may have had some kindness in him, it wasn't much. Ever since leaving the village, he could only eat half his fill each day and simply had no energy to spare for anyone else. He merely gave the boy a corner to nest in. Little Mouse was originally called Little Mute, but after it was discovered he could speak, he was renamed Little Mouse. No one knew whether he spent each day stealing, begging, or eating grass in the wild, but in any case he was still alive. During the past few days while he himself was injured, he had been lying in the wagon and cared for by Olivia, not staying in the tent at all, so he had no idea how Little Mouse had managed to get by. As soon as Leo leaned into the tent, he was driven right back out by the nauseating stench inside. The heavy smell of hair grease, foot odor, mold, and rot almost suffocated Leo. This was even filthier than a dog kennel. What rat hole? Leo's face twisted from the stench. Even with the original host's tolerance, the smell on his body was already nearing his limit, and he had never expected the place he lived in to be this horrifying. Leo threw out all the foul-smelling furs from the tent, rummaged through them, and picked out 2 snow bear pelts, one large and one small. Only these 2 pelts were still relatively intact. Leo tossed the smaller snow bear pelt to Little Mouse and beckoned, "Come with me." Seeing that he didn't move, Leo reached out, grabbed the back of his neck, and easily lifted him up, carrying him like that all the way to the riverbank. It was noon by then, and the bright sunshine added a touch of warmth to the harsh winter day. Leo found a spot sheltered from the wind behind a huge boulder and threw the snow bear pelt into the water. After stomping on it a few times, he saw dirty water bursting out of it in a rush, while a layer of rainbow-colored grease floated up on the surface, making him click his tongue in amazement. After unfastening the brace on his left hand and laboriously taking off his clothes, Leo glanced at Little Mouse, who was standing there blankly in a daze, and said, "Come help me." Little Mouse woodenly stepped forward and helped Leo take off his clothes and pants. Standing naked in the river, Leo shivered as he scooped up water with a rag and rubbed his thigh a few times. Watching the blackened, dirty water continuously spread from his body into the river, and seeing his darkened skin visibly lighten, Leo felt a strange sense of comfort. When was the last time he had bathed? There was no such memory at all in the original host's fragmented recollections. With his limited mobility, Leo sat down on a rock in the water, threw the rag to Little Mouse, and promised, "Come scrub Grandpa's back. If you do a good job, I'll reward you with a black bread." At the words, "black bread," Little Mouse's eyes brightened noticeably, and he jumped straight into the water, grabbed the rag, and began scrubbing Leo's back with all his might. His pants were soaked in the water, and the thick, hard layer of dried mud on them dissolved, turning into sludge and sloughing off. From the childhood experience of the original host Leo, it was clear that this thick layer of mud was Little Mouse's insulation, since those thin clothes of his were nowhere near enough to block the cold wind. Perhaps after washing up, Little Mouse would take advantage of the bright sun and go roll in some mud pit somewhere again. After scrubbing for a few minutes, Little Mouse was already panting for breath, his hands and feet going weak. Looking at his reflection in the water, Leo saw golden hair, a sharply defined face, well-proportioned muscles, the standard build of a northern barbarian. Though only 17, he could already be called a strong young man. Although the original Leo had grown up wild, luckily he was tough enough and hardworking enough. If any household had something good to eat, he'd sniff out the smell and show up at their door. Not a single strip of smoked meat could stay hidden until spring. The woods outside the village were riddled with pit traps he had dug, and the nearby rats and rabbits were on the verge of extinction. He ate so much that the food chain nearly broke, and even the large beasts had no choice but to move away and migrate. When it came to meat consumption, if he ranked second in the village, no one dared claim first. Looking at the soaking wet little ratlet, black mud dripping off him into the water, Leo said with disgust, "You should take a bath too. You're filthy and stink to high heaven. While the sun's strong, wash your clothes too." The little ratlet stood there blankly, without moving. What kind of man is afraid of a little cold? Jump into the water, and it's nice and warm. Take your clothes off, Leo threatened impatiently, or you won't get any bread. Only then did the little ratlet slowly take off that ragged set of clothes whose original color could no longer be made out. Underneath was a yellowed silk nightshirt. Once the nightshirt came off, the two stood naked face to face, sturdy muscles and jutting bones forming a stark contrast. Leo bent his arm and showed off his bicep, saying smugly, "I'm telling you, someone like you, I could take on 100. But as he spoke, he froze. "Where's your little thing?" He hurriedly grabbed the little snow bear pelt from the riverbank and wrapped the little ratlet up in it, demanding, "Where's your little thing?" Then he immediately came to his senses. How stupid would someone have to be to ask a question like that? The little ratlet still looked dazed and wooden, only asking in a soft, timid voice after Leo carried her onto the bank, "The bread. Are you still giving it to me?" Tucking the little ratlet under one arm, Leo returned to the camp and found the busy Olivia. Scratching his head, he asked with simple earnestness, "Could you heat up a pot of water for me? What do you need it for?" Olivia moved over to Leo in confusion and sniffed with her little nose, then nodded in satisfaction. "Didn't you already wash up? This little girl hasn't washed yet. If she washes in cold water, I'm afraid she'll freeze to death." "Humph, you feed her, give her a place to stay, and now you're even giving her a hot bath. You really are taking good care of her." Olivia gave a light huff and turned her head away from him, but she took the little ratlet by the hand and led her toward a tent off to the side. The little ratlet clearly knew Olivia. As soon as her hand was taken, she quickly leaned in, trying to curry favor. But the other girl imperceptibly let go of her hand and put some distance between them. The snubbed little ratlet didn't seem to mind at all and obediently followed her into the tent. Leo couldn't very well follow them in, so he could only duck into Uncle Yuliang's tent on the other side. As the leader of the caravan, Yuliang had the largest tent in the whole convoy. The tent even had partitions. Besides the inner section for sleeping, the outer section held a round table with a map pinned to it by a dagger, surrounded by a ring of people. Yuliang was in the middle of assigning tasks, while several of the caravan's key leaders listened obediently at the side. Whoever was called by name stepped forward and answered yes. And not a single person raised even the slightest objection the entire time. It all carried something of the atmosphere of a military tent discussing strategy. Yuliang, an imperial soldier retired and returned home, had in the span of a year successfully won everyone's hearts with insight and judgment far beyond that of ordinary villagers, becoming the unquestioned authority in the village. Even from the perspective of a transmigrator, Yuliang's series of moves was impossible not to admire, enough to make one suspect he was the real protagonist. After Yuliang had just returned home and figured out the village's current situation and plight, immediately used all his savings to buy food, recruit militiamen, and forge weapons, assembling a militia of around 50 men in a short time. After a few months of fattening up and training, he led them in clearing out and driving away nearby beast dens and non-human tribes, expanding the village's living space. He also successfully persuaded a small merchant caravan to alter its trade route, taking a one-day detour through his village so they could sell off the furs, beast fangs, and herbs stockpiled there. Unfortunately, the little village had only enjoyed a few good days. Just as it seemed to be thriving, it was immediately invaded by a beastfolk scout squad. After resisting for a period of time, many of the surrounding villages had turned into ruins, and Yulian knew there was no point in stubbornly holding out any longer. He decisively gathered up the refugees, expanded the militia, and at the same time, through the connections he had built over 10 years of military service, he barely managed to get a pioneering certificate. Then, at considerable cost, he wiped out a wolf den and successfully hunted down a herd of wild cattle, turning them all into dried rations and cold weather tents. In the end, he set fire to the village and led everyone on the migration. Before burning the village, he had already sent people to the town many times to seek help from the Night Lord to whom his village belonged, but naturally received no response. When the refugee caravan, whose homeland had been destroyed by the orcs, appeared outside the town, the Night Lord kept them outside with a look of disgust and tossed them a cart of bran, leaving them to fend for themselves. With no other way out, the refugees could only continue migrating south, heading for the wonderful new homeland Yulian had described. Throughout the journey, there were of course setbacks, conflicts, deaths, and injuries. But in the end, whether they were villagers who left halfway or the 300 elderly and weak who reached the destination, at least most of them survived. In this era, for commoners to accomplish such a feat, it absolutely counted as a miracle. The original Leo was naturally one of Uncle Yulian's staunch supporters. This wild and unruly little savage obeyed no one but Uncle Yulian. Seeing Leo walk into the tent, a trace of a smile appeared on Yulian's bearded face, but he immediately glared and barked. "Is your injury healed yet? You're wandering around all day. I've put up with you for a long time." Leo instinctively shrank his head, smoothly clutching his chest and putting on a pained expression, yet he asked, "What are you discussing? We're already here, so why is there still so much to deal with? What the hell do you know? 300 people have to eat, drink, piss, and shit. What isn't a problem?" Yulian had no desire at all to explain anything to a brainless battle maniac and waved his hand as if shooing away mosquitoes. "Hurry up and recover. Once you're better, take some men out to scout and get a clear picture of the surrounding area. Whoever needs driving off, drive them off. Whoever needs beating, beat them. This is our home from now on. We can't be getting ambushed all day long." As he spoke, he looked at the person beside Leo. "Valeri, take some men and dismantle all the useless wagons. Put up the palisade first. Just set a few rows in any 3 directions. As long as there's some basic cover, that'll do. Once we've settled in, then turn them into houses." The strong man named Valeri was clearly very experienced in this. He nodded in acknowledgement and went out to get to work. "Rashka, take a few people. Burn the northern pasture clean, and tomorrow take people to start reclaiming wasteland. Okay, Rusev, go with the militia and make a couple of sweeps around the area to see if there's anything that can be sold for money. Our savings are running low." The elderly man named Rusev, already around 50, nodded when he heard this, but said nothing. Rusev was the owner of the village general store, almost the only person in the village who traveled regularly between the village and the town. The villagers' exchange of goods with the outside world was all handled through him. Compared with the villagers who scraped a living from the soil, he was undoubtedly more knowledgeable and better aware of what was valuable. Both of his sons died in an attack by an orc raiding party, leaving only a young grandson. Like Valeri and Rashka, he was one of those in the caravan who were capable and would not leave halfway through. Looking at the rough map on the table, Yulian scratched his chin and heartened everyone with great confidence. "I've been here before. This place has everything. If we all work together and tough out the first half of the year, the second half will be easier. Once we're better off, I'll hire a survey team to come take a look. If they happen to find some mineral deposit, we'll be rich. Ha ha ha." But his words did not have much effect. The circle of people in the tent were the core of the entire pioneer party. They knew far more than the villagers outside, who were merely surviving like puppets on strings. By the time the pioneer party had reached this place, they were already at the end of their rope, out of supplies and out of food. Compared with that, the hardships on the journey were merely an appetizer. If it had been the former Leo, he would surely have been infected by Yulian's optimism, drawn in by the bright future he described, and become fired up and full of fighting spirit. For the moment, he might even have forgotten the current hardship of barely getting enough to eat from one meal to the next. But he was no longer the same person he had been before, so he did not become blindly cheerful. Instead, he stared at the map, deep in thought. Uncle Yulian deliberately chose to migrate at the end of winter and the beginning of spring, not only to avoid the large-scale plundering by beastfolk scout squads after spring began, but also to rush to reclaim enough wasteland at the river bend when the thaw came, so they could catch the black rye sowing season in April. With the fertile land of the river bend and a climate far warmer than the banks of the North Ice River, as long as the Pioneer Party had enough labor, they could more or less achieve food self-sufficiency in the first year. The problem was that fewer than 300 people remained in the caravan, and more than half of them were the old, the weak, women, and children. Most families also lacked the ability to survive on their own and had no savings at all, choosing to stay only in the hope of receiving Julian's protection. Those families that still had savings and enough labor had mostly been unable to endure the torment of migrating through the northern frontier in winter and had chosen to stop in the prosperous villages and towns along the way. So even in the most ideal situation, even if all 300 old and weak people joined in, achieving food self-sufficiency in the first year, they would still have to face the problem of where their food would come from during the more than half year before the black rye harvest. Relying on fishing and hunting alone was impossible. Although the small village where Leo lived had formed naturally, it was one of the few farming villages along the North Ice River. 100 years ago, the village had been granted by Lord Frelov to a knightly family as a fief. In theory, aside from their own houses and allotted plots, everything on the rest of the land belonged to the Knight Lord. The villagers all depended on farming to make a living. Not to mention that the local lord banned hunting and logging. Even if they had been freely allowed to fish and hunt, most villagers were too poor to even own fishing or hunting tools. The best hunters in the village, aside from Julian, were Leo, this self-taught little wildling. Moreover, the villagers' homemade bows, arrows, and bone arrowheads could only shoot small animals like rabbits and foxes. They could not even kill an adult elk. If that were not the case, then during the kobold attack, a single volley of arrows would have been enough to drive them back. Not to mention that the wilderness of this world also held numerous foreign race tribes, beast dens, and even magical beasts. Sending a group of poorly armed villagers to hunt in unfamiliar wilds was practically asking them to die. Or, what kind of, or do you want? While Leo pondered a way out and stared at the map in thought, Julian waved a big hand. Gold, silver, I won't be picky. Even copper would be acceptable. What are you dreaming about? A copper mine, seriously. Rio snorted. No copper mine, but do you want an iron mine? An iron mine? What iron mine? Urian and the others in the tent instantly widened their eyes, exchanging bewildered looks. Where did an iron mine come from? Rio took out a javelin head from the chest in the corner of the tent and tossed it onto the round table, saying smugly, "Isn't this one?" Aside from the tip of the blade, the surface of the javelin head was already covered in a thick layer of rust. Even so, it could not hide the dense pockmarks all over it. This was a javelin left behind by the kobolds a few days ago. Urian had gathered them up, handing out the still intact javelins to the villagers as weapons for self-defense. As for the damaged ones, the javelin heads were removed, to be reworked into farm tools once they had settled down, for use in reclaiming wasteland. In the chaotic wars among the Empire's Grand Dukes, it wasn't only human lives being thrown into the battlefield, but also vast amounts of war supplies such as weapons and armor. Compared to the Empire's other regions, the cold northern frontier was already extremely barren. The limited steel resources were monopolized by the nobles, forged into weapons and armor, and sent to the battlefield in a constant stream. As a result, the price of iron among the common people soared, and many villagers could not even afford a hoe. Seeing that everyone was still confused, Rio patiently guided them. Where do you think the kobolds' iron tools came from? They couldn't have bought them, right? Urian slapped his thigh and asked in delight. You mean the kobolds dug up an iron mine? Rio pointed at the javelin head on the table. The answer spoke for itself. Anyone who used their brain a little could make that connection. Especially for an otaku like him, steeped in fantasy novels and games. Words like kobolds and mines were naturally linked in his mind. What Rio had been thinking about all along were the problems of mining and transporting the iron ore. How good was the iron or vein the kobolds had dug up? Was it suitable for mining? Where would the labor for extraction come from? And after mining it, how would it be transported and turned into money? Those were the real key points. But the others did not think that way. Their attention had landed on something else. Urian stared at Rio in disbelief and cried out, "Good heavens, Mundo! You grew a brain?" That question instantly set off the whole tent, and everyone immediately broke into discussion. No way, my pig is smarter than him. I think he was possessed by the kobold he bit to death. Or maybe a demon's soul transmigrated into his body. Right, soul transmigration. Soul transmigration. Rio looked at everyone speechlessly. How could you all piece together the truth in just a few words, yet fail to come up with even one way to fill your stomachs? In that case, the current plan needs to be adjusted a bit. Urian played with the javelin head in his hand, equally crude in both quality and workmanship, his face full of excitement. First, fortify the camp so everyone has a place to settle down. Then find the kobold's lair, figure out a way to break through it, and locate the iron mine. Everything else can be put aside for now. After everyone had left, and only Urian and Rio remained, Rio finally frowned and asked, "What's the use of finding the iron mine first? Iron ore can't be eaten, and we don't have a blacksmith. There's no road for more than 30 li from here to the western watchtower, so the iron ore can't be transported out at all. Shouldn't the priority right now be finding food first?" These doubts couldn't be voiced in front of everyone. Otherwise, the morale that had finally been lifted by the prospect of an iron mine would be crushed again. What do you know? Don't worry about anything. Once your injuries heal, hurry up and go scout, find the kobold's lair, and see if we can take it. Urian, as usual, gave no explanation and simply waved him away. Rio had no choice but to shake his head and crawl out of the tent. Only after everyone had gone did Urian sit down with effort, the excitement and confidence on his face slowly fading, no longer able to hide his exhaustion. A blonde girl with a striking figure, Olivia, walked in. Seeing the weary, pained look on her father's face, she went over with a worried expression, crouched down, rested herself on Julian's knees, and whispered painfully, "Dad." She lifted Julian's pant leg and saw that his deathly pale skin was covered in black veins, spreading all the way from his calf into his boot, while giving off a faint rotten stench. "I'm fine. It's just a minor problem. I can hold on." Returning to the outside of his own small tent, Leo saw that Little Mouse had already finished bathing and come back. She was now laboriously spreading the clean snow bear hide over the propped-up wooden poles to dry. The tattered furs Leo had thrown outside had also been sorted out by her and piled again in the corner of the tent. Not a single scrap had been thrown away. Even the animal fur scattered all over the floor had been gathered into a ball and kept. She was wearing a worn, thick wool sweater with a cylindrical, coarse linen smock over it, so she no longer looked so thinly clad. But these two pieces of clothing that Olivia had lent her were obviously far too loose. On her, they looked like some kind of religious robe, the hem even dragging on the ground, making her stagger when she walked and looked both ridiculous and cute. This was also the first time in Leo's memory that he had seen her looking clean. After a hot bath, the little girl's face finally had a hint of color. With her black hair and black eyes, her features looked delicate and pretty, and her skin had a snowy whiteness unlike that of the lower commoners. She was just far too thin. Prolonged hunger had caused her cheeks and eye sockets to sink in noticeably, giving her a somewhat eerie look. In fact, even when she had been all muddy before, it had been easy to tell that Little Mouse was a little girl. But unfortunately, the original Leo had been a simpleton who had never cared about her gender at all. Leo even felt that, given the original host's temperament, he probably wouldn't have cared about species either. If a sudden fit of kindness struck today, he'd bring home even a mouse to save it. If that kindness ran out tomorrow, he'd stew it up and eat it. Leo was still holding the silky little nightgown Little Mouse had taken off. Once washed clean, it had dried on its own before there was even time to hang it up. Held in his hand, it was only a tiny bundle, like clutching a small piece of rosy cloud. Without even unfolding it, he could see the iridescent glow reflected from the sunlight on its surface, and beyond its silky smooth feel, it gave off a constant warmth. Silk of this texture was something that even Leo, who came from modern society, had never seen in his life. Perhaps this was what they called magical fabric, the thing Little Mouse had relied on to stay alive through the northern winter. This surely meant that Little Mouse's identity was anything but ordinary, but Leo had no interest in looking into it. The current main quest was solving the problem of survival. A side quest like this, one that required time and energy, could be dealt with later. "Hey," Leo stuffed the silk nightgown into Little Mouse's hands. "Put it on in secret. Don't let anyone see it, or it'll be stolen sooner or later." Cradling the nightgown, Little Mouse still said nothing, only kept her head lowered in silence. "Right? While I was injured these past few days, where did you sleep? What did you eat?" Leo voiced the doubts he had earlier. Little Mouse opened her mouth, then stammered, "Olivia, big sister, made a tent. For me." She spoke the imperial language very pleasantly, but her accent was clearly not a northern one. Leo, who in this life had never left his village, couldn't tell where it was from. Was Olivia really that nice? She obviously hadn't seemed very warm toward Little Mouse. However, this also matched Leo's impression. In his memory, back when he was in the village, every snow rabbit he caught was cooked by Olivia, but Olivia was often reluctant to slaughter them, especially when food was still plentiful. For a period of time, Leo had fairly good luck, to the point that Olivia's family kept as many as 7 rabbits and a fawn. Although the poor and conservative villagers were clearly resistant to a drifter, Olivia still couldn't bear to watch Little Mouse freeze to death. Glancing at the sun overhead, Little Mouse hid the pajamas away, then took Leo's hand and led him toward the center of the camp. At that moment, the camp was ringing with clanking sounds everywhere. Pitching tents, dismantling the planks from freight wagons, setting up fences, clearing away dead branches, weeds, gravel, and other debris. The villagers all looked relaxed, and the atmosphere was much livelier than it had been on the road. Rows of wooden fences were erected around the camp, and the villagers' tents were pitched against them, barely shielding them from the wind and snow. If they were attacked, these wooden fences would serve as temporary defenses, at least able to block ranged attacks like arrows and javelins. The center of the pioneer camp was rather open, with only a half-open tent set up between 2 freight wagons. This was the expedition's kitchen, and several cages were stuffed beneath the wagons, raising some chickens, ducks, and rabbits. Altogether, they had 14 heads and 38 legs. 7 or 8 village women, young and old, were busily at work preparing food for the convoy, while several girls, led by a sturdy woman, came back from outside the camp carrying baskets filled with plants Leo couldn't name but had eaten before. It still wasn't mealtime yet, but several large pots were already boiling, bubbling with unknown wild vegetables, beans, minced radish, and dried meat, while the tent beside them carried the aroma of baking bread. The bread was of course not freshly baked, but stockpiled hard bread reheated for the moment, club-shaped loaves that could double as weapons. Without reheating, ordinary knives couldn't even cut them apart. The so-called meat soup in the pots was likewise meant to go with the hard bread. If it wasn't soaked in hot soup, the hard bread was no different from hardwood. If one looked only at this scene, it really did give something of the illusion of abundant food. This was also the atmosphere Yuri Yang had deliberately created by placing the kitchen in the center of the camp, but Leo, as one of the core members, knew that these 2 wagon loads were almost all the food the entire group had left. Little Mouse pulled Leo over to one side of the kitchen wagon, where more than a dozen little kids had already gathered. They were all in rags, sallow and skinny, their faces full of anticipation. When Little Mouse came over, not a single one of them greeted her. But when they saw Leo, they all started calling out Big Brother Leo and Captain. These children were all villagers' sons and daughters, and nearly all of them had been beaten by Leo before. Yet the more they had been beaten, the more they admired Leo's strength. Still, they didn't dare draw close to show affection the way Little Mouse did. No one could be sure Leo wouldn't kick them flying with one foot. Because the hard bread, mixed with large amounts of bran, beans, acorns, and cassava from the antler tree, was difficult to digest and could easily bloat small children to death, the convoy's younger children were given different food. After waiting a short while, Olivia came over carrying a basket. Seeing Leo standing among the children, she looked slightly surprised, but did not pay him any attention. Instead, she took out a key and unlocked the cargo compartment of the wagon. From the locked wagon compartment, she took out a bundle of long bread sticks. These long loaves were just as blackish and of unclear ingredients, but at least they had been fully fermented and were soft enough. Olivia tore the baguette into 2 pieces and handed them out, half to each person. After finishing the bread, Olivia opened the basket again and gently announced, "Today, everyone gets an extra egg." Amid a burst of cheers, Olivia handed out eggs even smaller than ping-pong balls while seriously reminding them, "The adults will all be very busy during this time, so you must behave, help your families with chores, don't leave the camp and run around, and don't go to the river to catch fish. If you don't behave, just wait until I catch you. You can get ready to go hungry." The caravan's chickens hardly lay eggs in winter, and they've only managed to save up about a dozen along the way. Originally, they were planning to trade them for coarse grain at a market town on the road. But after missing the last market town, Olivia simply decided to use them as a reward for the children for successfully reaching the destination. The cold and hunger along the journey had left many of the children gaunt. If they didn't get something nourishing soon, they would barely be able to stand. Little Mouse was the last one in line to receive food. Holding the soft black bread in her hands, she looked at the egg in Olivia's hand, but hesitated and did not dare accept it. The little girl had keenly sensed that the people in the pioneer camp did not like her. Even the kindest big sister, Olivia, was no exception. In fact, in the cold northern lands, no one likes vagrant children. When people can barely keep their own families alive, every extra bite given to a homeless child means one more chance that someone in their family will starve to death. She gets one too. She's not one of us. That's right. She's a vagrant. She doesn't have a father working for us. She shouldn't be allowed to eat. Several children looked at Little Mouse and shouted indignantly. "Wanna die?" Leo raised an arm and clenched his fist. The muscles on his arm twisted like steel cables wound together, frightening the group of children into silence. With one hand, Leo snatched the egg from Olivia's hand. With the other, he pinched Little Mouse's cheeks, easily forcing her mouth open, and popped the egg into it. Done. But Little Mouse, with the egg stuffed in her mouth, gently pushed Leo. She pushed him in front of Olivia. During this time, she had survived on the half piece of black bread she received each day. So of course, she wanted to share this chance to stay alive with Leo. Big Sister was so kind. Surely she would give Leo a share of food too. Olivia and Leo stared at each other wide-eyed. She guarded the cart behind her warily and said angrily, "You're going to steal the children's food too?" Leo hadn't planned to eat any. But at that, his argumentative streak flared up, and he glared back. "Who says I'm not a child too? How old am I anyway?" Olivia rolled her eyes at him speechlessly, then turned around, took out a piece of dried bison meat about the size of a little finger, and stuffed it into his hand, saying, "Here, have something tasty." Leo took the dried bison meat, stuffed it into his mouth, and chewed, feeling like he was gnawing on tree roots. As he chewed, he watched Olivia's back as she bent over and searched in front of the wagon. Olivia wore a light yellow fitted bodice and a coarse cloth dress. There were even a few patches on the dress. This was much the same attire as the other village women. The only difference being that she also had a piece of black fur draped over her shoulders for warmth. But her fully developed figure made the outfit look especially attractive. Every move, every smile and frown made her seem like the heroine of some game or anime. Olivia, AI-generated art, unable to change the clothes. Compared with the other villagers in the village who scraped a living from the dirt, Olivia, with an imperial soldier father, was practically like a landlord's daughter. Her literate mother had cared for and raised her well before passing away, and she had hardly ever worked in the fields. As a result, her figure was nothing like that of others her age, broad-shouldered and thick-waisted. She was also gentle and kind, not the sort to open her mouth and spew crude curses that would make even men blush. Being literate and good with numbers, she naturally became her father Julian's right-hand woman. Being literate and good with numbers, she naturally became her father Julian's right-hand woman, responsible for managing the expedition team's property and supplies. During the time Leo was injured, it was also Olivia who stayed by his side and took care of him, washing him, changing his dressings, feeding him. Only because she spooned hot porridge into a mouthful by mouthful did Leo get enough nutrition to repair his body and survive. It was impossible not to feel grateful deep down, but in the original host's memories, he had simply been too familiar with her. The way the two of them communicated was by arguing, so thanking her was out of the question. In the memory fragments deep in Leo's mind, there were plenty of scenes from childhood where he bullied her until she ran home crying for her mother, and then her mother invited him to a meal. Scenes of her mother lecturing him while he ate made Leo cry out inwardly at how ridiculous it was. What? You get fed for bullying someone? Nice. Olivia rummaged around for quite a while, and only after gathering all the supplies she needed did she turn around. Only then did she turn around and see Leo staring at her, but for quite a while. Blushing, she said angrily, "Why are you still here?" That's it. Leo was dumbfounded. Only then realizing that the so-called tasty food was that tiny strip of wild buffalo jerky he had just swallowed. Humph. This is beef jerky. I couldn't even bear to eat it myself. Olivia was furious, feeling that her good intentions had been wasted. Leo was also angry, because he had waited all this time for nothing, so he turned and left. He turned and left, seeing Little Mouse clutching a piece of black bread and following close beside him. He reached out, tore off a big chunk from it, and stuffed it into his mouth. Little Mouse looked heartbreakingly at the black bread with a corner missing. Then she spat out the egg she had been holding in her mouth for ages and ingratiatingly held it out to Leo. Looking at the egg dripping with saliva, Leo barked, "Get lost." After eating a meal from the camp rations meant for adults, Leo felt even more keenly how difficult their situation was. Before, lying on the wagon, he had drunk wheat porridge for several days in a row until his mouth was so bland he could hardly stand it. He had thought that once he recovered, he would finally get to eat something good, but after swallowing a meal of hard bread that nearly chipped his teeth, he discovered that what he had enjoyed before had actually been top-tier treatment. He domineeringly occupied a big pot and fished around in it with a ladle for quite a while, but in the end he still couldn't scoop up anything resembling a decent broth. That night, Leo lay down in the tent, staring blankly at the top of it. Fragmented knowledge from his previous life and survival experience from this life kept flashing through his mind, trying to combine into a way to easily solve their current predicament. If only he had some kind of cheat like an encyclopedia search. Baidu, first episode of Wilderness Survival. How do I lead a group of the old and weak to fill their stomachs? Little Mouse carefully crept in. She laid down in the pile of tattered pelts by Leo's feet, inching a little closer to his calf without making it obvious. A few minutes later, a little closer. A few minutes after that, a little closer again. Feeling the chill coming from by his feet, Leo let out a soft sigh inwardly and lifted one leg, resting his entire foot on Little Mouse's body. Little Mouse happily hugged Leo's calf and stopped moving. Although he was protected by pajamas that seemed to be made of some kind of magical fabric, the warmth they provided was clearly not enough to drive away the severe cold of late winter and early spring. And with Little Mouse's frail vitality and barely life-sustaining nutrition, she was completely unable to provide enough heat. With his leg held in Little Mouse's arms, it felt to Leo as if he had stretched it outside the tent. It took a full 10 minutes before the heat radiating from Leo's strong body warmed it up again. "Leo, can I call you Dad?" In the darkness came the Little Mouse's barely audible voice. "Why? They said that only if you have a dad do you get food." "All right then, Dad." When they woke up the next day, the Little Mouse was already gone. Leo searched around the camp but didn't see her. He asked everyone he met, "Where's my little mouse?" One child pointed to the big river outside the camp and said timidly, "I think she went toward the riverbank." Leo searched along the river for a while before finally spotting her on a shallow gravel bar. At that moment, the Little Mouse's tiny body was squatting on the riverbank, shivering and curled into a ball, while reaching into the shallow water to feel around. Not wanting her clothes to get wet, she had flipped the overly long hem up to her waist and tied it there, revealing her bare lower body, from thighs to soles. Her snow-white skin was covered with shocking frostbite sores. Olivia had more than one child to take care of, and she had no spare pants left to lend the Little Mouse. Finally, she cupped her hands together and caught a tiny fish the size of a finger joint, so happy that her big eyes narrowed into adorable crescents. Afraid the little fish would wriggle free, the Little Mouse had no time to wash the mud off it. She couldn't wait to stuff it into her mouth. The younger children in the pioneer party could receive food only once a day, and for breakfast they could only snatch a few bites from their parents' bowls. Or a few cooked peas would be handed out to each person, but obviously no one would call the Little Mouse over. So she could only secretly save a few bites of bread for herself, or find food in the wild like this. The good thing was that unlike other children her age, she didn't have to join her family in labor, so she had a whole day to look for food. The bad thing was that food was simply too hard to find in the Northern Territory winter. Leo stepped forward and grabbed her cheeks, slipping in 2 fingers to try to pinch the little fish out. The Little Mouse hurriedly sucked in, struggling to swallow the fish whole before she could chew it up. Then she hugged her head to fend off the attack, only to realize that it was Leo. Like a child caught red-handed after doing something wrong, she lowered her head uneasily. "I was wrong. I should have let Dad eat the fish first." Leo didn't even have the heart to lecture her, and only said, "You're way too slow at catching fish. Watch me." As he spoke, he moved some stones around and quickly cleared out a small pool, then built a little dam. Leaving an opening in the small pool that connected to the river channel, Leo clapped his hands and called to the Little Mouse, "Let's go. Don't play by the river alone, or Olivia might not give you any food. What about the fish? Come back tonight, and there'll be some. What about the bread?" "What bread?" "The one you promised yesterday." After Leo shamelessly wheedled and pestered her, Olivia finally made an exception and secretly gave him a piece of soft bread. Under the Little Mouse's admiring gaze, and amid her repeated cries of "Dad," Leo rewarded her with the bread. Breakfast was still the same hard bread that was difficult to chew, and only half the weight of dinner, served with a big pot of boiled hot water. Besides that, there was also a section of plant root that looked somewhat like a sweet potato, but even more like a yam. This was a Northern Territory specialty called antler cassava, which could survive in frozen soil and was even more filling than bread. Its only drawback was that it was poisonous, and eating too much could easily kill you. After struggling through breakfast, Leo made a grand wave of his hand and said to the young man beside him, "Ivan, pass the word. Assemble the militia for training." In just a short while, the militia members had all assembled. Only 20 people showed up, and among them were several with bandages on. The pioneer party had already been suffering from a severe shortage of able-bodied young laborers. The militia members were once again the main force among them, and they all had work to do during the day. Back when they were incorporated by Julian in the village, they could only squeeze out some time for training before breakfast and after dinner. As for the entire group, the only true full-time soldier was Leo, the only one who didn't have to farm. The reason the other militiamen joined at first was simply because Julian could provide an extra pound of bread every day as an additional ration for the militia. That was no small matter. Many poor farmers might not even have a full pound of rations a day in winter. But after being tempered by this migration, the surviving militiamen had come to deeply understand the importance of armed force, especially in this undeveloped wilderness. So at the first call, aside from the 7 or 8 veterans Julian had stationed around the camp for patrol and guard duty, the remaining militiamen quickly gathered. Even the wounded didn't miss it. After more than a year of extra rations and training under Julian, these militiamen were visibly sturdier than ordinary villagers, and their clothes were relatively thicker as well. Half of the militiamen wore crude armor sewn from various furs, making them look like a bunch of Tsarist-era Russian hunters. Since there was no way to provide enough food, the militia basically did not carry out any high-intensity physical training. Most of the time, Julian or other retired veterans taught the militiamen the basics of weapon handling, offensive and defensive techniques, and battle formations. Many combat skills looked simple, but they could greatly improve the militiamen's fighting ability and survival rate. Fighting and killing enemies were not as simple as imagined. If you merely gave 2 villagers weapons, they might slash at each other more than a dozen times and end up covered in blood without either suffering a serious or fatal injury. But trained and battle-tested soldiers were different. On the battlefield, there were often only 1 or 2 chances to strike, and those 1 or 2 chances were the key to victory. That was also why crippled retired veterans could still easily deal with 3 or 5 village thugs and ruffians. Besides stronger physiques, it was even more because their attacks were swifter and more lethal. After the former militia captain left the group midway through the migration because his wife and children had fallen ill, Leo, whose combat ability had improved the most, was promoted and became the new militia captain. However, because of the hardships of the migration, Leo had never gathered the militiamen for intensive training like Julian and the former militia captain had. With the mindset of a transmigrator, he had a tiny bit of a different view on the way to fight. Close quarters hand-to-hand combat was just too crude, not elegant enough. Ranged attacks were the true king. Leo, who had once been bitten to death by a kobold, had no desire to try that again. Although the original host's irritable and combative temperament kept affecting him, the elegant soul of the transmigrator still remained dominant, and he had a strong aversion to melee combat with cold weapons. Unfortunately, the village where Leo was born was not one known for archery. The villagers were all honest farmers. If it had been a village that lived by fishing and hunting, just gathering the men of the village would have been enough to form an archer squad with decent combat strength. But that was fine. They were tough and strong, so he could teach them something else first. Leo first had the militiamen line up properly, then loudly announced, "Starting today, we will practice javelin throwing. My requirements are simple. Within 50 yards, it must not hit the ground. Within 20 yards, 5 hits out of 10 throws. Those who fail to meet the standard will have their dinner ration halved." The militiamen looked at each other, and a brown-haired young man named Vichy, only 2 years older than Leo, hesitated before speaking. "But we still have to clear wasteland, right? Uncle Julian said that in these 3 months, we have to reclaim at least 300 mu of wasteland, otherwise we won't make it in time for the spring sowing in April." Leo froze for a moment and asked, "How big is 1 mu of land?" All the militiamen immediately showed looks of utter disbelief, followed by intense disdain. Their captain's ignorance was so shocking that even illiterates were astonished. "You're a bona fide country person. Don't you have any idea how big a mu is?" Looking at everyone's expressions, Leo was also speechless. "How would I know what kind of mu system you people use? Who knows whether it's an acre, a hectare, a Chinese mu, or some other messy kind of mu? Besides, the original owner had never farmed either and didn't even have a basic concept of the mu system." From a militiaman's gestures, Leo roughly figured out the mu system in this world. The area the villagers called 1 mu was about the same size as an acre in his previous life. To put it more intuitively, it was 4,000 square meters, about half a soccer field in size. Although the farming techniques here were extremely backward, and land reclamation didn't need the kind of intensive, deep cultivation of his previous life, it could even be said to be very primitive. Second only to slash and burn farming. but to reclaim nearly 300 acres of wasteland in 3 months, without any machinery, relying on this group of fewer than 300 people, mostly old and weak, was still hard for Leo to imagine. Reclaiming wasteland and planting cultivated land were completely different concepts. From burning off the brush, turning the soil, and clearing gravel and shrubs, to leveling the land, building ridges, and digging canals, and finally to sowing, maintenance, and harvest. The labor required for 1 mu of wasteland was more than 10 times that of cultivated land. That was only because Riverbend Peninsula had a vast stretch of grassland and lakes, with flat terrain, fertile soil, and abundant water, making it highly suitable for reclamation. That gave Julian confidence. Places a little farther from Riverbend, as well as the vast plains across the river, were covered by primeval forests full of giant conifers. That kind of land and vegetation was not something a pioneer team of refugees like them could conquer. Having grown up in a modern rural area, Leo had subconsciously always thought that as long as there were no taxes, each person could fill their stomach by farming 2 Chinese mu of land. But this was the remote frontier of the north, and the farming techniques they possessed were considered quite backward even in this world. And the grain they had was nothing like genetically improved high-yield crops. In the original owner's previous village, they could only plant 1 crop of rye a year, on 1 acre of land. They sowed 200 pounds of seed grain, but could only harvest 800 pounds of grain. The grain harvested in a year, after deducting the seed grain and without paying taxes, could only keep 1 person from starving on 1 acre of land. By that calculation, the 300 mu Julian demanded really wasn't much. Even if they met the target, they would still be a long way from being adequately fed and clothed. 300 acres, which would be more than 1,800 Chinese mu. Even if you gave me a tiller, I still couldn't finish plowing it. But the original Leo was obviously not a reasonable person. Knowing all this would only make him more troubled, and then more irritable. Leo made perfect use of this advantage and said domineeringly, "I don't care. We train first. Whoever wants to leave, I'll beat them." The militiamen looked at each other, but not a single one made a sound. Many of them might not necessarily have been convinced by the young Leo, but they absolutely feared his fists. Moreover, the militia, who had only a few days ago been bloodily cut down by a concentrated volley of cobalt javelins, already had a strong impression of the power of javelins. That rain of javelins had directly taken the lives of more than 10 militiamen, and several more were still lying in the camp tents, unable to get up. This was the deadliest form of ranged attack the militia had suffered during their migration, second only to the flying axes of the orc warriors and the headhunting spears of the troll scouts. So the group carried various javelins, spears, and wooden sticks to an unoccupied clearing outside the camp. Leo visually estimated the distance, temporarily changed the rules, and drew a straight line at his feet. Pointing at the small hillside more than 20 meters away, he said, "Start practicing throws from here. A hit on a tree trunk counts as a valid throw." A few small trees grew sparsely on the hillside, and hitting a tree trunk from more than 20 meters away was no easy task. One militiaman eagerly stepped forward, picked up a handy javelin, and hurled it out with all his strength. The javelin flew crookedly over a distance of 20 meters and landed several meters in front of the small trees. The remaining militiamen burst into laughter and confidently took their turns. In the end, only a few javelins successfully flew into the small grove, and only 1 javelin luckily stuck into the base of a tree trunk. The results were dreadful, but Leo was not disappointed. As a former sports student in his previous life, he understood very well. Without training, without a running start, and with such poor quality javelins, this level was already pretty good for ordinary people. He had seen worse before too, javelins flying sideways, spinning through the air, or skipping across the ground like stones on water. The javelins collected by the militiamen could only be said to resemble javelins in shape. Aside from those seized from the kobolds, the rest were all kinds of pole weapons of varying thicknesses, with several pitchforks mixed in. Their weight ranged from 0.5 kilograms to 3 kilograms, and the feel when throwing them was worlds apart from standardized javelins. Being able to throw 120 meters successfully on the first try already counted as having considerable athletic talent. Continue. Leo first let the militiamen throw 2 rounds of javelins. Only after retrieving the javelins they had thrown did he begin carefully demonstrating javelin throwing techniques, the proper grip, and how to apply force. There were throwing methods with a running start and without one, as well as the throwing angle and so on. As he explained, he stepped backward, then held the javelin level over his shoulder and did a few slow-motion approach steps. Then he threw the javelin. The javelin he threw traced an elegant and stable arc through the air, easily flying more than 20 meters and precisely nailing itself into the trunk of a small tree. It even pierced through the trunk, with a section of the spear tip jutting out from the back of the tree. Perfect. Years of athletic training in his previous life, combined with the boost of his strong physique in this life, had directly maxed out his javelin throwing skill. And this was while he was injured and not in a condition fit for exercise. The current Leo was practically a born athletic prodigy. And it wasn't just javelin throwing. If this brute strength and athletic talent had been placed in his previous life, with just a little training, not to mention an Olympic decathlon champion, he could at the very least have looked down on everyone in multiple events. The militiamen present were also stunned by this display and began whispering among themselves. Who throws the best javelin? Answer 1. Leo, who had never thrown a javelin before. Answer 2. The kobold chieftain who was bitten to death. The correct answer, transmigration. After training for about an hour, Yuliang hurried over from the camp. By this time, the militiamen's javelin throwing was already starting to look the part. After mastering the basic throwing techniques, the strong and sturdy militiamen could throw the javelins in their hands 30 meters even without a running start, though their accuracy was still worrying. Improving throwing accuracy required long-term practice, as well as standardization of the throwing weapons. Those things could only come slowly. Looking at the militiamen rubbing their sore arms, yet wearing excited expressions, Leo shouted loudly. Morning training is over. I'll barely count you as qualified. From now on, every morning you must train javelin throwing for at least 1 hour. Yuliang, who had been watching from the sidelines for a while, looked delighted. Patting Leo on the shoulder, he said, "Who would have thought? Brat, you've got this trick up your sleeve too?" Ow, ow, ow. Leo dropped his shoulder and shrank back, dodging Yuliang's pats as he explained, "I figured it out while hunting before." "Good, very good. This way, we'll be even more confident about wiping out the kobolds. Don't be in such a hurry. Just watch closely. I've got plenty of skills." Leo beamed. "Huh, how capable are you?" "As if I wouldn't know." Yuliang lifted a foot as if to kick him. "So happy, are you? Are your injuries healed? If they are, then go work in the fields." The militiamen who had finished training didn't even have time to rest before heading of their own accord to the grasslands north of the camp, joining the bustling land-clearing team. They had originally been the main force in clearing wasteland. When it came to fighting, farming was still a peasant's proper trade. Yulian had once promised that in the second year of land reclamation, fields would be allotted to each household. Every adult man would receive 1 acre of permanently tax-free land. And as for how much farmland they would actually get, that depended entirely on how much land the villagers could open up in the first year. These were exceptionally favorable terms unlike anything found anywhere else, in any frontier territory. With the rise of the feudal lord system, the living space of self-owning farmers was shrinking by the day, and on the estates opened up by noble lords. Let alone the land itself, nothing on the land would belong to the subjects. In fact, only on the empire's sparsely populated frontier was there still a large base of self-owning farmers. In the economically developed and densely populated southern provinces, the noble manor system had spread across everything, and self-owning farmers had long since vanished, leaving only tenant farmers and serfs. Bored, Leo followed Yulian to the land-clearing site and squatted on a rotten tree stump, watching the working people at labor. More than 100 young and middle-aged men shifted between forming a V shape and a straight line. They swung hoes, iron shovels, and pickaxes, turning over bit by bit the land beneath their feet, blackened by fire. The remaining elderly, weak, women, and children followed behind them, hauling away the stones that were dug up. The grass roots were piled into heaps and set alight. In just one short morning, they had already turned over several mu of land. This place was truly ideal for reclamation, far easier than the villagers had expected. Villagers young and old were all utterly absorbed in it. Leo was also full of emotion. In the fragments of the original owner's memories, at this time of year the land back home was still covered by snow a foot thick. Even well-worked fields had to be loosened with a pickaxe to break up the frozen soil. Although they had migrated only a little over 1,000 li to the southwest, the climate was completely different, practically like moving from northeast China to North China. From the frigid zone to the temperate zone, fertile land and scenes of fervent labor always stir up people's hopes and make them forget suffering. But the longer Leo watched, the more he felt something was wrong. He suddenly realized it, sprang to his feet, and shouted, "Where are the donkeys? Where are your donkeys?" "What donkeys?" The Padua family's kid already led them off to graze. Why aren't you using the donkeys to plow the fields? Leo asked angrily. The moment he said this, it immediately set off a burst of laughter. One villager mocked. Ha! Use donkeys to plow? Why don't you have donkeys learn magic too? Leo was practically beside himself with anger, and turned to ask Yulian beside him. You've never seen donkeys plow fields? He had originally wanted to say plow, but in the original owner's memories there surprisingly wasn't even a word for plow. He couldn't very well ask Yulian in Chinese, could he? Yulian, who had served in the army for 10 years and traveled far and wide with broad experience, stroked his chin and mused. Donkeys really can plow fields, but it must be difficult, right? Perhaps it requires casting some kind of magic. Leo couldn't be bothered to argue nonsense with him. Cursing under his breath, he strode back toward the camp. How could farmers who work the land not have a plow? This was something that had existed since primitive society. A medieval peasant having never seen a plow was about as absurd as a 21st century shut-in having never seen a cell phone. At this level of productivity, and Yulian still dared to lead the villagers out into the wilderness to reclaim land. One could only say the people of the north were truly reckless. Back at the camp, despite Olivia's attempts to stop him, Leo roughly snatched away and smashed the best pointed shovel in her family's possession, then chopped down several curved branches as thick as wrists, and, after some simple trimming, nailed them together in a cross. Then he mounted the bent pointed shovel onto the plow bed at the very bottom, and a simple plow was made. A simple curved shaft plow, even simpler than the one the protagonist had made. Looking at the crude and rudimentary curved shaft plow before him, Leo felt a great sense of accomplishment. In the first week after transmigrating, I invented the curved shaft plow. Hoisting it onto his shoulder, Leo had Olivia lead a donkey with him back to the wasteland. Tying the donkey's lead rope to the plow and steadying the plow body, Leo shouted, "Move." The donkey did not budge. Olivia understood what Leo was trying to do and, chuckling softly, took hold of the donkey's reins. Olivia pulled the donkey forward in front, while Leo held the plow steady and gently pressed the plowshare into the soil. The land on the riverbed plain was far too soft, and the only resistance in it came from dry grass roots and a small number of pebbles. The donkey hardly needed to exert itself at all to pull the curved shaft plow forward, and a furrow a foot deep appeared in the ground behind them. The villagers, who had originally been absorbed in opening up the wasteland, had little interest in watching the commotion. In their eyes, Leo, who had never farmed before and was stubbornly single-minded, could not possibly make anything worth seeing, until within just a few minutes he easily surpassed the militia members, who were already drenched in sweat. Only then did people notice the divine tool Leo had made. Wu Liang, who had watched Leo's whole operation from the side, had his eyes light up and was beside himself with excitement, even blurting out an imperial court speech. I've seen this thing before. It looks familiar. Very familiar. In fact, just like on Earth, plows had already existed in this world thousands of years earlier. In the fertile southern provinces of the Orlandese Empire, there were even two-wheeled heavy plows pulled by 2 horses or 4 horses. The grain output of the land was more than 3 times that of the Northlands. Otherwise, it would never have had enough strength to unify the east coast of the continent of Morning Light and drive the fierce and warlike beastfolk out of the northern provinces, all the way into the depths of the snowfields north of the North Ice River. But the cold and barren banks of the North Ice River were different. The main sources of income for the lords here came from the cattle, sheep, and horses on their pastures, the beast pelts, magical herbs, and the rare timber from their hunting grounds and logging camps. They had no interest in organizing their subjects to reclaim land and farm it. The rye and beans collected from the subjects were only used to feed horses anyway. Noble lords would never eat such coarse grains produced in this frigid northern land. In fact, few nobles were willing to stay on their fiefs north of the Anzino River. Their lands were managed by stewards raised by their families, while they themselves lived on the relatively warmer south bank of the Anzino River. And the little village where Leo was one of the very few farming villages naturally formed along the North Ice River because the land was suitable for cultivation. Before Wu Liang joined the army, the village had no draft animals such as donkeys, cattle, or horses, and many poor villagers did not even own a single iron hoe. Even the best-off households only kept a few pigs and sheep. They had neither enough labor nor enough allotted land to support the whole family, and more than 1/3 of their food came from the gifts of nature in the nearby mountains and forests, acorns, mushrooms, wild vegetables, arrowroot, and the like. If Wu Liang had not retired and returned home to become the village headman, then even if the villagers knew how terrifying the beast folk scout squads were, they could only have quietly waited for death like the other nearby villages. If this were the South, where the manorial system was well established, these free commoners could still abandon their land and become tenant farmers on a noble landlord's estate. But in the Northlands, they could only become refugees and starve to death in the ice and snow. With Leo's demonstration, Julian immediately understood the tremendous benefits of the curved shaft plow. Although he claimed to be well-traveled and to have seen it all, in reality he had only served for 5 years as a border scout at the frontier watchtower of Count Frelov's domain. Then, because of his strength and military merit, he was conscripted into the infantry legion stationed at Wingod Fortress for another 5 years, rising from conscript infantryman to regular infantryman to elite heavy infantryman, and finally to the highest rank a common soldier could attain, Imperial Sergeant. Julian had spent all his time in military camps. As for something like a plow, he had only seen one occasionally, just a fleeting glimpse while on the march. At once, Julian called over several villagers who were the most skilled at carpentry in the village. Under Leo's guidance, they made 18 simplified curved shaft plows in one go, drove out all a dozen-odd donkeys from the camp, and sent them into the fields. Leo squatted back down on the rotten tree stump. Fully satisfied, he watched the villagers tilling the land at triple speed in a scene of feverish activity, when a distant voice seemed to echo in his mind. You have unlocked iron plow and ox farming technology. Farmer productivity +1. Food output +1.